time since anybody needed to be a climate scientist to know that there was something wrong with the world that we live in. If we look around the world just over the last 12 months, we see what the devastation that climate impacts have dealt, from the hurricanes and the cyclones, killer floods and droughts and famines, but literally touching every single corner of the world. We've had Puerto Rico, Bermuda, and Dominica flattened by hurricanes. Dominica's damage is worth 224% of that country's GDP. Mozambique, where the destruction of one single storm left 1 million people on the brink of starvation, not because of the impact of the climate, of the storm itself, is because of over decades we've gutted the ability of Mozambique to provide even the most basic of services to its own citizens. 40% of its national income being paid out into unsustainable debt repayments to the global north. We talk about India over the summer, the fifth biggest city in India, Chennai, running out of water, fresh water for its citizens. And in the next decade, it's estimated that something like 40% of India's 1.3 billion people will be without access to fresh water. We could talk about how droughts have impacted the Southern Africa, huge droughts in sub-Saharan Africa. There is the reality of the climate crisis and the climate violence is it's here. It's not something that's going to happen in the future. It's absolutely here. And that is a very, very critical starting point for us. Now, we all remember the 2018 IPCC report, which talked about the importance of keeping temperatures well below 1 degree, 1.5 degree, and that if we trip past that guardrail, we'd unleash even greater feedback loops, which would impact on food production, lead to more frequent and more violent extreme weather impacts, and would also have devastating economic impacts on the global south that would dwarf anything that had happened in terms of the financial and economic crises that many people in the global south have lived through. Now, for many people in the global south, that was 1.5 to barely stay alive. This was not that this would be the safe temperature level. Their temperature level and their impacts were already there. Now, many of us remember the famous champagne glass and the inequalities of how these emissions are produced and who's responsible. 50% of the world's poorest people, only responsible for 10% of global emissions, while the richest 10% of the world are responsible for 10%. Now, that's only one part of that climate story, because if you put that same graph with economic inequality, you find that the poorest 50% of the world's population only have 2% of global wealth, while the richest 1% own something like now over 40% of global wealth, while the 10% closer to 70 and 80%. We've seen billionaires, whose wealth is so extreme now that 26 people own as much wealth as half of the world. We see Amazon raking in $20,000 each and every second. And today, Amazon workers in the United States will be going on strike together with other low-paid workers, demanding protection for them and their colleagues, demanding a decent living wage, demanding protection in terms of health and safety. Now, that is the world in which we are now looking at. And I think the challenge to us is not to simply think about climate as an environmental issue. It's never been an environmental issue. It's fundamentally been an issue of justice. It's always been an issue of fundamentally of economic injustice. When we understand the root causes of this climate crisis, that the challenge for us is not simply now to think about what we were against or to simply expose the fact that the climate crisis is upon us. I believe that our real challenge now is to be able to think about the vision to go forward. We're talking now about how do we move, not just talking about what is a just transition, but how do we have a just recovery? How do we have a recovery that is not simply about the global north or in the nation state, but it's talking about the global south as well? How do we connect our fights so that we can build our collective power together? And I think, again, International Workers' Day is a very, very important moment for us to be able to do that again, is to be able to draw our connections together, to say that our vision for the future can't be that simply we want to reduce greenhouse gas emissions away from fossil fuels and leave half the world in poverty and inequality. We have to start talking about actually what is energy for? How do we build a sustainable economy? What is renewable energy without a massive use of resources and materials from the global south and a new wave of violent extraction in terms of the global south? So I'm a great proponent, and we've been working a lot on, and I wanted to use this opportunity to talk about that we need a global Green New Deal. We need a global Green New Deal that connects our fights around COVID, that connects our fights around workers' rights and inequality and economic injustice, and connects our fights around climate. And it needs to be a holistic analysis, and an analysis that our system has failed, that our neoliberal economic model has failed, that there is no turning back or dialing back or returning back to normal, that we have to dial forward. And one of the things that neoliberalism, I think, has done to so many of us, it's taken away our imagination. It's taken away our ability to be able to imagine that there is something different. But we all know that our power comes as a movement, not simply when we make political demands, but it comes also from being able to have a vision of the world, to be able to articulate that vision, to have clarity about what that vision, to have an understanding of what are the transformational political demands that can underpin that global vision. And then, most importantly, the question about how do we build power? How do we build power about connecting our movements to movements together? And we have an historic responsibility in the UK. Yes, the COP26 has been postponed. It will happen in 2021. In 2021, the UK will host the G7 meeting and the COP26. This is a moment for us, for our movements, on behalf of all global movements, is to be able to build a powerful climate justice movement in this country. Not a movement that is separated from the labour movement and the movement around workers' rights. That is not a movement that is separated from the fight around migrant and racial justice, but a movement that brings all of those issues and connects it together, that creates the movement of movements, that understands that building of power is not simply at the global or at the organizational level. It's about involving people. And I think one of the positive things that we can take from this moment of the corona pandemic is, despite the failures of government, despite the multinationals wanting themselves to be bailed out, and we have now Virgin and we have fossil fuel companies basically saying that they are going to be the saviors of the recovery, and that they needed to roll back environmental regulations, that climate regulations can't be brought in terms of them, that they have to recover the economy. The hope that lies has come from who? It's come from ordinary people. It's come from the solidarity people are showing with each other, the solidarity they're showing at a family level and at a community level, from the mutual aid groups to the solidarity that people are showing globally. This is a moment for us to rebuild our movement and re-establish the importance of internationalism and global solidarity. This, I say, is the biggest challenge, I think, facing us over the next 12 months. And if we don't have a vision, and a movement that is able to do that, let's not fool ourselves. The right already is organizing. The right is organizing at a global level. We know that their toxic mantra of walls and fences, of turning our back, of looking insular within the nation state, of blaming minorities and the rise of racism and xenophobia, are already spreading around the world. When we look at Trump and Bolsonaro, Modi, Netanyahu, Duterte, we see the rise of this authoritarianism as an answer to these multiple crises. And if we don't have a compelling answer, then they are already looking at how are they going to rebuild their recovery? What kind of recovery will they have? And as we know, the right never wastes a crisis. And I think there's a very, very important lessons for us to learn from 2008, when the financial crisis took place. The system didn't collapse because of the crisis. It was, many people thought, well, it's exposed capitalism, we've all the job done, everything's going to be all right. In fact, it reinforced the economic inequalities. It rebuilt the power of the banking system, and it left people paying the price with a decade of austerity. What we can't allow to happen is that the frame around austerity and who pays for this corona pandemic to be put on the backs of workers and poor people in both in this country, but neither can it be done on people in the rest of the world. So I want to give on International Workers' Day, I saw you behind Rob and Lynn, the May Day banner, and I want to remind us all that on all of our union banners, we say workers of the world unite. We don't say workers of Britain. We don't say workers of that. We are an internationalist movement. And as an internationalist labour movement on this day, we have an importance to make sure that these movements that are being built, that this recovery that is talked about is truly international and truly global. Thank you.
Thank you.